grandmother kept her jewelry in a Maxwell House coffee can. Not a velvet box, not a safe, a dented red and gold coffee can she'd had since before I was born. She said it was the best hiding place in the world because nobody ever looks twice at something ordinary. I thought about that a lot after she died. The reading of her will happened on a Tuesday in my uncle's living room because that's where my family does everything important. Graduations, holiday dinners, the kind of arguments that don't end until someone leaves. My uncle had arranged the chairs in a loose circle like we were about to have a therapy session. My aunt sat next to him, already dressed like she was going to a closing. My grandmother's attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Bellamy, sat at the folding table my uncle had dragged in from the garage. He had a leather folder, reading glasses on a chain, and the patience of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly how it was going to go. I was the youngest person in the room. I was also, as far as my family was concerned, the least important. My grandmother had 3 children. My mother was the middle one, the one who moved away, who married someone nobody approved of, who came home for Christmas and left before New Year's because staying longer always turned into a fight. I grew up hearing that my mother had chosen her path, which was how my uncle said it when he wanted to sound neutral but meant something else entirely. My father passed away when I was 19. After that, it was just my mother and me in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, making it work. I went to community college, transferred, got a degree in accounting. I was 28 years old, and I had a job I was proud of and a life I had built without anyone's help. My grandmother knew that. She used to call me every Sunday and she'd ask about work, and she'd listen, really listen, not just wait for her turn to talk. She was the one person in that family who saw me clearly. So when Mr. Bellamy opened his folder and began to read, I sat up straight and I listened. My uncle got the house on Mercer Street, the one his family had been living in for the past 6 years, paying below market rent to my grandmother. My aunt got the antique writing desk and the pearl earrings. Various cousins got various things. Then Mr. Bellamy paused, looked up and said, "To my granddaughter Lee, I leave the contents of my sewing cabinet." My aunt made a sound. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was the kind of noise you make when something confirms exactly what you already believed. My uncle said the sewing cabinet. Okay. Nobody looked at me directly. That was almost more humiliating than if they had. Mr. Bellamy finished reading. My grandmother's savings, a little over $1,340,000, accumulated over 40 years of working as a school secretary and never spending more than she needed to, went into a trust to be managed by my uncle for family benefit. The language was vague in a way that made my stomach tighten, but I didn't say anything. I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap and my face doing nothing. Afterward, my aunt offered me coffee. I said no thank you. My uncle pointed me toward the back bedroom, where my grandmother's things had been collected into boxes. The sewing cabinet was there, a small pine cabinet with a door that latched with a little brass hook. It was the size of a nightstand. It had sat in my grandmother's craft room for as long as I could remember. "You can take it today if you want," my uncle said from the doorway. "We need the room cleared out by Friday." I said I'd come back for it. He nodded and left me there. I stood in that room for a moment. It smelled like her. Lavender and cedar, and something faintly sweet. Her reading chair was in the corner with an imprint still in the cushion. I put my hand on the sewing cabinet and I thought, she left me this on purpose. My grandmother did not do things by accident. I took the cabinet home that evening in the back of my car. My mother helped me carry it in. She didn't say much about the will reading. She had stopped expecting things from her family a long time ago, and she had the kind of quiet dignity that comes from surviving disappointments so many times they stop surprising you. But when I set the cabinet down and unlatched the door, she stood close. Inside, spools of thread, needles in a pink cushion shaped like a tomato, a pair of embroidery scissors with stork-shaped handles, a small tin of buttons, and underneath all of it, tucked flat against the bottom of the cabinet, a cream-colored envelope sealed with a strip of tape that had my name written on it in my grandmother's handwriting. Just Lee. My mother made a sound like she was holding her breath. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, written in my grandmother's neat script. the handwriting of someone who learned penmanship when it was still taught as a discipline, and folded inside the letter was a document I had to read 3 times before I understood what I was holding. It was a deed. A property deed, signed and notarized, transferring ownership of a parcel of land in Appalachian, Ohio, 12 acres in Hocking County, to me, Tunley Ann Kowalski, signed by my grandmother 14 months earlier. The letter explained everything. My grandmother had bought that land in 1987 with money she saved before she was married. It was hers alone, not part of the marital estate, not something that passed to my grandfather, not something anyone else in the family knew about. After my grandfather died, she'd kept paying the property taxes quietly, year after year. It wasn't worth much when she bought it. But in the past decade, the area had changed. There was a state park nearby now, a popular hiking trail. A developer had approached her 2 years ago about purchasing it. She had declined. She wanted it to go to me. At the bottom of the letter she had written, "I know your uncle will manage the trust for himself. I've known it for years. This is what I can do. Use it wisely. You always have." I sat on my kitchen floor and read that letter 4 times. My mother read it once, put it down, and went to stand at the window for a long time without speaking. The next morning, I drove to the Hocking County Recorder's office and confirmed that the deed had been properly recorded. It had. The transfer was complete. The land was legally mine. It had been mine since 14 months ago, and no one had known. After that, I called an attorney, not a family friend, not someone anyone had recommended to me. I found her myself, a real estate and estate attorney named Miss Ostrowski, and I paid for a consultation with my own money and sat across from her desk and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "And you haven't told your uncle about the deed?" I said I hadn't. She looked at me for a moment. "That was smart," she said. She also told me something I hadn't known, that the family benefit trust language in my grandmother's will was almost certainly challengeable. The trustee, my uncle, had broad discretionary authority and almost no accountability written into the document. If he had drafted or influenced that language, and if my grandmother had signed it without independent counsel, there could be grounds for a challenge. She said she'd need to look at the original will and the surrounding circumstances. I said, "Give me a little time. Here's the thing about my uncle. He moves fast when he smells money, and he is not careful when he's confident." He had spent 6 years living in my grandmother's house at a below-market rent, and had apparently convinced himself that he had, through sheer proximity, earned it. He had been managing her finances for the last 3 years, since her eyesight started going. I had always wondered in the back of my mind what exactly that managing looked like. I started asking questions, not to him, to the county records office, to the property tax database, to the state's online business registry. I am an accountant. Looking at numbers and finding the places where they don't add up is what I do for a living. What I found, over the next 6 weeks, was not subtle. My uncle had taken out a home equity line of credit on my grandmother's house on Mercer Street 2 years ago, while she was still alive. The line was for $90,000. The house, which was now being left to him in the will, had a current assessed value of $310,000. He had used that line of credit to fund what appeared to be a small business venture that had since closed quietly. He had not told my grandmother, or rather, he had not told her in writing. But my grandmother had told me, in one of our Sunday calls, that she was letting my uncle borrow against the house for something he was trying, and that she expected him to pay it back. She had said it the way you say something you know will not happen, but are not ready to face yet. She had never seen it in writing. She had signed documents he brought to her at home in her last years, when she was tired and trusted him, and couldn't read the fine print without her glasses. A $90,000 HELOC she hadn't fully understood, secured against a house that was supposed to pass to him free and clear. And then there was the land. What I could not yet confirm, but what Miss Ostrowski suspected when I showed her my findings, was that my uncle may not have known the Hocking County land existed, but that he had made representations to someone that my grandmother's estate was fully accounted for. There was a buyer, apparently, someone who had been in contact with my uncle about purchasing estate assets, which, in his framing, included everything. Ms. Ostrowski told me to keep recording my conversations. Ohio is a one-party consent state. I bought a small digital recorder and I started keeping it in my bag. In the third week of November, my uncle called me. He was friendly in the way he sometimes was when he wanted something. Warm, a little nostalgic, asking how I was doing and how my mother was and whether I'd been able to move on from the will reading. He said he knew it must have been disappointing. He said my grandmother had loved me. Of course she had. But she had also wanted to make sure the assets were managed responsibly. I said I understood. He said he was actually calling because there was a potential buyer interested in some of the estate's miscellaneous assets, some land, possibly some personal property. He wanted to make sure there were no surprises. He asked if my grandmother had ever given me anything directly, any deeds or documents. I said she'd left me her sewing cabinet. He laughed. Right, the sewing cabinet. A pause. Nothing else? I said no. I could hear him exhale, this little release of tension. I noted the time on the recorder. Okay, he said. Good. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. We said goodbye. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes after I hung up, and I thought about my grandmother in her craft room with the lavender smell and the imprint in the chair cushion. I thought about her writing that letter in her neat, careful handwriting, and sealing it with tape, and putting it at the bottom of the sewing cabinet where she knew I would find it. I know your uncle will manage the trust for himself. She had known. She had known for years, and she had done the only thing she could do. She had moved what was hers to give, and she had given it to me, and she had trusted me to handle the rest. I called Miss Ostrowski the next morning. The process that followed was not quick and it was not simple, but here is what happened. Ms. Ostrowski filed a petition to challenge the trust administration and to require a full accounting of my grandmother's assets during the 3 years my uncle had managed her finances. This is a legal right of any interested party in an estate, something my uncle had apparently not anticipated I would know about or pursue. When the accounting was produced, under court order, the HELOC appeared. The business expenses appeared. Several cash withdrawals over the past 2 years appeared, totaling just under $60,000, with minimal documentation. My uncle hired his own attorney. There were several months of back and forth. At one point his attorney sent a letter suggesting that I was acting out of grief and family resentment, and that my claims were without merit. My mother received a call from my aunt, who said she hoped I understood what I was doing to the family. I understood exactly what I was doing. The recorded phone call in which my uncle asked me directly whether my grandmother had given me any deeds or documents, and in which I confirmed the sewing cabinet was provided to Ms. Ostrowski, combined with the deed, which was already a matter of public record, and my uncle's subsequent attempt to negotiate a sale of estate assets to a third-party buyer, it established that he had known, or should have known, that he was not the sole authorized party for those assets. The buyer, when contacted by Miss Ostrowski's office, withdrew immediately. He had no interest in being part of a disputed estate transaction. The trust challenge was settled before it went to a full hearing. My uncle agreed to a full repayment of the HELOC balance from estate funds, a documented accounting of all cash withdrawals, and a restructured trust with an independent co-trustee appointed by the court. A portion of the trust, about $80,000, was distributed directly to my mother and me as residual beneficiaries my grandmother had intended to include, but whose interest had been obscured by the original trust language. And the land in Hocking County, 12 acres, a recorded deed, already mine, stayed mine. I had it appraised after the dust settled. The 12 acres, with the trail access and the proximity to the state park, came in at $218,000. I didn't sell it right away. I went out there first on a Saturday in early spring when the trees were just starting to come back. I walked the perimeter. There was a creek on the eastern edge, and the sound it made was the kind of quiet you don't hear in a city. I stood there for a long time. My grandmother had stood on this land probably in 1987 when she bought it before I was born. She had seen something in it worth keeping. She had kept paying the taxes on it for 36 years because she believed in holding on to things that matter. I thought about the coffee can with the jewelry. The best hiding place is something nobody looks twice at. The sewing cabinet. She knew. A few months later, I did sell, but to a conservation buyer, not a developer. The land will stay undeveloped. There's a clause in the deeds that says so. My uncle and I don't speak. My aunt sends a card at Christmas. My cousins are somewhere in the middle, doing what cousins do, which is mostly nothing. My mother and I had dinner last weekend at the kitchen table, and at some point she looked up from her food and said, "She would have liked how you handled it." I think she's right. I don't have a lot of patience for people who mistake silence for weakness. My grandmother spent her whole life being quiet in that family, staying in her lane, keeping the peace, never making it a whole thing. They took that for passivity. They took it for smallness. But she bought 12 acres in 1987 and didn't tell a single person. She wrote a letter in her careful handwriting and hid it under a pincushion and a tin of buttons in a pine cabinet nobody wanted. She was never passive. She was patient. There's a difference, and if you know it, you already understand everything about this story. I still think about that pine cabinet sitting in the back of my car on the drive home. Nobody fought me for it. Nobody even glanced at it twice. And that right there is the whole story in one image. The people who took everything that looked valuable walked away certain they had won. They never stopped to wonder what was in the thing they handed off without a second thought. My grandmother understood something that took me years to fully see, that the way you carry yourself when you have nothing to prove is exactly what protects you when it matters most. She never announced what she was doing. She never made speeches at the dinner table about fairness or legacy. She just quietly paid property taxes on 12 acres in Hocking County for 36 years and wrote a letter in careful handwriting and tucked it under a pincushion. That's not passivity. That's a kind of moral clarity most people never develop, knowing what you value, holding it without noise, and trusting that the truth doesn't need an audience to be real. What my uncle did had consequences not because someone punished him from the outside, but because the choices he made over years. The undisclosed HELOC, the vague trust language, the phone call where he asked me directly if I had any documents. Those choices created the exact conditions that undid him. He wasn't unlucky. He built something that could only collapse. That's how it tends to work. The shortcuts people take when they believe no one is paying attention have a way of becoming the very evidence that surfaces later. I wasn't born knowing how to read a property deed or file a petition for trust accounting. I had to learn. I had to sit across from Miss Ostrowski and ask questions I was embarrassed not to already know the answers to. I had to spend 6 weeks in county records and online databases doing work that wasn't glamorous and didn't feel like winning. It just felt like showing up. That's the part nobody talks about. The intelligence that actually protects you isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being willing to learn what you don't know, and then doing the unglamorous work of applying it. And the part that required something from me that I didn't know I had, that was the waiting. There were weeks when I wanted to pick up the phone and tell my uncle exactly what I had found. There were nights when the unfairness of it felt physical, like something sitting on my chest. I had to choose, over and over, to be patient instead of reactive, to trust the process instead of the impulse. That kind of steadiness, the ability to stay the course when everything in you wants to react, that's not something you're born with. It's something you build quietly, the same way my grandmother built everything she left behind. She kept her jewelry in a coffee can because she knew that value and appearance have almost nothing to do with each other. She left me a sewing cabinet because she knew I would open it. I think about her every time I have to decide whether to speak or to wait, and most of the time I wait, not because I have nothing to say, but because I've learned that the people who act from patience almost always outlast the people who act from greed. The land is protected now. The creek still runs on the eastern edge. And somewhere in all of that, I think, she's satisfied.